got to go up to the bridge and you've got to win the trust of the gentleman or lady before you that's in command of the ship.
So what happens though if it is dangerous, what the captain wants to do? What predicament are you in then?
Obviously, the captain has overriding responsibility for the ship.
Right.
But if the captain's decision is a dangerous decision, then as a pilot, if you cannot get through to them that they're about to do something dangerous, then you have other options.
The Sail Away Uncensored Cruise Podcast.
So where did your maritime career begin?
So my maritime career began in 1985, actually in the port of Southampton, in the container port, November 1985. I joined a container ship as a deck cadet, 16-year-old deck cadet at the time.
Wow, that's a long time ago.
Yeah.
Where did you
It'll be
go on?
40 years in November that I've been in the industry.
And what sort of experience on different types of vessel have you had?
So I started off on container ships. I did a brief period on bulk carriers, lumping ore and coal between Europe and mainly South America. That lasted for my cadetship, the end of my cadetship. In those days, there were very, very few cadets. At the end of my cadetship, they let me go. They made me redundant. I went and delivered yachts in the Mediterranean for a month or two, and then started with cruise ships. Started with P&O Princess in June 1989.
Is there a memory from your training or early career that still sticks with you to this day?
Probably several, and in those days, health and safety wasn't as high up the ladder as it is these days, and they did drop rather a lot of bauxite on me in the hold of the bulk carrier when I was a cadet trying to clean the holds. That's just stuck with me.
Yeah.
The other thing that stuck with me is the size of the holds on the container ships. They were big enough to house a badminton court. So the thing that you're shown when you join the ship is, this is the bridge. Now let me show you the badminton court where you can exercise. So that I remember that. That was my first day on board. I got shown that. So that's pretty much printed there.
I know from when I worked on ships, like most of the job is very safety related.
Yes.
Like it's all about
Yes.
safety. Do you think that it's all totally necessary, or do you think sometimes it's a bit?
No, it's all totally necessary. Some of the activities that in the 80s you used to engage in now, you wouldn't think of doing now because the risks are properly highlighted, properly dealt with and properly managed on board the ship. When I was there, the risks were known, but they weren't managed correctly. Going into a ballast tank to inspect it, we know the atmosphere in there is going to be a bit dodgy, but don't worry, we'll air it for a few hours and then wear this gas detector, and off we go. There was no sampling of the atmosphere, no permit to work or anything like that. So no, it is necessary. It's necessary for the procedures to be there and to be followed. And the ISM code that came in the early 90s obviously helped that, gave that a real leg up. So no, it is necessary.
Yeah. So for those who might not know what exactly a marine pilot does and how the role differs from a ship's captain, can you explain the differences in them? So
if we think about the captain, first of all, captains are expert at their own ships, and they're expert at getting their ships from A to B. So the passage, if you like, between port to port. To expect a captain to have advanced knowledge of the port when you get there is a little bit unfair, because once you get inside the boundaries of the port, the channels get very, very narrow, lots of other ships kicking around, lots of other risks that the captain's not necessarily aware of. So a pilot is somebody that has the conduct of the ship, is in charge of the speed and direction of the ship, who's not a member of the crew. And I bring my expertise out to the ship when I come there to allow the master to bring his ship into the port safely, because he's got somebody there that knows all the local knowledge, has all the local contacts, knows the topography, knows the channels, the regulations, and can advise the captain as necessary and take the ship in for him.
Would it be fair to say that in a way it's a bit of an insurance policy to have that level of expertise on board?
It is. It's a measure against a risk. Ships, particularly cruise ships, are getting much, much bigger now, and so bringing a cruise ship into a port, it's filling up a lot more of the channel than it used to. So having that expert knowledge of a pilot up on the bridge with the captain, and the pilot conducting the ship into the port, means that the ship can come in under the conduct of somebody who knows exactly how wide the channel is, or if there's a new bank that has suddenly arisen up, or if there's a buoy out of position. Masters are are sort of experts at their own ship, whereas we're the experts for the area in which the ship is transiting at the end of its voyage when it gets tricky.
So what are some of the most complex manoeuvres you have to carry out when piloting into Southampton?
Well, we've got 5 cruise ship berths in Southampton now. 4 of them are pretty much in a line. 3 of them in a line, 1 on its own, but 1 is tucked into what we call the ocean dock. It's the dock where Titanic sailed from.
Yeah.
That's sometimes a challenge to get in there because it's a little bit like a little cul-de-sac. You've got to swing the ship or drive the ship in, but it's not quite so straightforward. You're not putting the ship alongside a big long quay. And don't forget, the approaches to Southampton have the notorious Brambles turn as well, which is a 140-degree turn across the tide and wind, which is where the expertise of the pilot really does come in, because that's pretty tricky manoeuvre to get that round, particularly on cruise ships, because you can't just throw a cruise ship round like you can a container ship. If you turn the cruise ship too fast, it'll heel over, and that'll be uncomfortable at the very least for those on board the ship.
What would you say is the biggest hazard in Southampton water?
I think for cruise ships, that West Bramble turn. Yeah. If you try and turn too fast and the ship does heel over, it will cause everybody on board, at the very least, to feel uncomfortable. If you get it really, really wrong and you try and do it too fast, the ship will heel over so far that, you might even get injuries from the passengers if you heel too high.
Yeah.
So I think with cruise ships, because the berths, with the exception of the ocean dock, the berths are fairly straightforward. They're in that long line that's fairly accessible. That West Bramble turn on the way in is the one where the pilot's expertise really does come to play.
Yeah. Why is the Needles Channel so rarely used by larger ships?
We could bring in your dog here. I'll tell you why, because an old pilot described it to me really, really well. The entrance to the Needles Channels has a bank running down to the west of it called the Shingles Bank. And he once said to me that the Shingles Bank wags its tail like a dog. What he meant by that was that the sands out there at the Needles shift so much that unless there has been a very, very recent survey of that channel, cruise ship captains are very, very reluctant to come through because the bank may have shifted. So what was once safe water may not be safe water anymore. That's outside of our district. That's that's not part of the pilotage district. So we don't get to be on the ship then. The captain's got to bring the ship in through the Needles on his own. Yeah. So because there's no pilotage out there, perhaps that knowledge of the expertise of, where the tail of the Shingles Bank is on any particular day isn't there. Yeah. So it makes it very, very high risk. So that's why ships tend not to use it. If there's been a recent survey, you sometimes see a couple of them coming and going, but because that bank does move so much, that's what makes it so high risk, which means they take the much deeper route out to the east.
One of the unusual things about Southampton is that there's 2 high tides and 2 low tides a day, isn't it?
2 highs, 1 low.
2 highs, 1 low. Why is that?
That's because of the position of Southampton within the English Channel. If you imagine the English Channel to be like a long dish of water, when you tip the dish, you've got high water at Dover and low water at Land's End and vice versa. If you keep moving the long dish like this, you get oscillations that come along the dish, and right in the middle of that dish you'll get a double oscillation. Southampton is right at the middle of the English Channel, so you get that double oscillation on the high water. It's also a lot to do with the fact that there are 2 entrances to the Solent. There's the eastern and the western, as we've discussed, and the water will flow in from there. That complicates the tidal regime a little bit as well, but it's mainly because of our position along the English Channel that gives us that double high. It's got benefits particularly for big, deep container ships, because your high water stays high for longer. The disadvantage is that in a normal port, the tide would take 6 hours to go out. In Southampton, it only takes 3.5 hours to go out, which means the tides are much stronger.
So how far out do you usually board a cruise ship, and then what happens in those first few minutes when you get to the bridge?
So we board 12 miles off Portsmouth, adjacent to a structure called the Nab Tower. That's from the docks at Southampton via the main channel, about 26 miles. 26 nautical miles. The first few minutes are super important, and that's one of the cognitive skills of the pilot, is you've got to go up to the bridge and you've got to win the trust of the gentleman or lady before you that's in command of the ship. So you've got to come across confident and competent so that they put their trust in you to start conducting the ship. You've got to sound knowledgeable. You've got to give them all the information that they need. You've got to get the information from them that you need. So, number of rudders, propellers, and thrusters that the ships have, idiosyncrasies that the ship may have in its manoeuvring. You've got to have what we call a master pilot exchange. It's got to happen fairly quickly. But the real cognitive skill is that you've got seconds to form a relationship with somebody, a working relationship, which at the end of the day could have 8,000 lives and, several $1 billion worth of ship, managed between the two of you. If that relationship doesn't start well and you can't regain it and it's strained throughout the act of pilotage, that really does make it quite stressful.
So as much as having the knowledge, you have to have people skills to do it as well.
I think mariners have people skills. I think most mariners have people skills. I think that's a trait of most seafarers. But you're quite right, particularly pilots. You've got to have people skills. You've got to be able to win people over quickly. That's not by fooling them or pulling the wool over their eyes. It's by coming across as a confident, competent officer and making sure that the information you're giving the captain is genuine and relevant to what he or she is about to do.
Get 50% off your first order when you subscribe to Sail Away magazine. Get the digital version for £3.95 and the printed edition for £6.95 every 2 months. Subscribe today at sailawaymagazine.com.
Have you ever disagreed with a captain's judgment, and if so, how did you handle that situation diplomatically?
We do occasionally have disagreements with captains. When we say a disagreement, it doesn't escalate, and we never let it escalate into an argument with the captain, because that would break down the master-pilot relationship to the point at which it's dangerous. We will take the time to explain to the captain our thinking, tell him why we're thinking something, why we think a certain way to do it is better. We'll take the time to explain. If you don't take the time to explain, just say, Captain, I think you need another tug. That's wrong, because the captain's I don't want to pay for another tug. Well, I think you should. Captain, we need another tug because your windage area and this wind, we need the tug force. Take your time to explain. So, no real incidents jump to mind with me, but there have been times in the past where I've either suggested we do something one way and the captain said, no, I want to do it the other. And as long as the way the captain wants to do it isn't dangerous, sometimes it's better just say, okay, Captain, we'll do it your way. If the way the captain is suggesting does have hazards, or there are a good reason why you shouldn't do it, you've got to take the time to explain it. And normally once you take the time to explain it, the captain will be, oh, I see. Oh, thank you very much. Yes, we will do X, Y, Z.
So what happens, though, if it is dangerous, what the captain wants to do? What predicament are you in then?
Obviously, the captain has overriding responsibility for the ship.
Right.
So, in other words, the captain's decision is final.
That's it.
But if the captain's decision is a dangerous decision, then as a pilot, if you cannot get through to them that they're about to do something dangerous, then you have other options. Right. The harbour master of a port has something called a powers of direction. So he can give a legal instruction to a captain, and that captain must legally follow it. He does that with duty of care, so that takes some of that responsibility from the captain. So let's say I was coming in a ship and I felt it needed a tug to execute the manoeuvre that we wanted. And the captain was saying, no, I don't want a tug. Absolutely not, pilot. And I knew that not taking the tug was going to put the ship in danger and everybody on it. Then as an absolute last resort, and I'm trying to think back through my 25 years as a pilot, and I can maybe think of one or two incidents from maybe 10, 15 years ago where, the harbour master had to intervene. But you do have an option there to report it to the harbour master and say, look, I think this is what happened. The captain's not doing it. Please, can you, and so the captain will get a direction. You will take that tug.
So there's always a safety net.
There is always a safety net. Always a safety net. The captain has ultimate discretion over the safety of the ship. But when it comes to the manner and timing of the arrival of the ship into port, then the harbour master can give a direction, and he gives that direction with some care.
Yes or no answer. With you and your colleagues, is there a particular cruise ship that does visit Southampton where you're like, oh, that captain's on board? Or have you got, over those years, you've developed quite close and strong relationships.
I think even the youngsters develop very, very strong, close relationships with the pilots, with the captains of cruise ships. We see 500 cruise ship calls a year in the port of Southampton. So your average pilot that's at a stage where they are able to pilot those ships will see a lot of cruise ships. And the captains come and go. You know, the cruise companies are not silly. They're not going to change the captain every week because the captain will never get experience of the port. So, you know, for the captains to gain a bit of experience, they'll keep the captains on, you know, for a long portion of the season. And, you know, maybe change them once or twice. So everybody gets to know the captains. And, you know, even though, obviously, as somebody that's been doing it a long time, I know the ones that have been there a long time. I sailed at a lot of them, of course, in my past career as a deck officer on cruise ships. But even the youngsters will get to know these captains very, very well, and they'll form a working relationship with them, which means that actually I never hear the youngsters say, I mean, it never happens to me, but I never hear them say, oh, I didn't like Captain so-and-so, because I think they gain, you know, a lot of confidence from the fact that the captains are coming and going, and the captains gain confidence of seeing, even if it's a youngster, they're seeing him for the fourth or fifth time. Oh, I remember you, and it really works.
One question I was going to ask is, which ports in the world do the pilots have overriding authority over the captain?
There's only one place in the world where that happens, and that's Panama Canal, where the pilot makes all of his decisions with duty of care, so that if the pilot says we've got to do this, and the captain says no, it's unsafe, pilot says no, we must do it, and then there's a result from it which isn't particularly good, then the pilot or pilotage authority will take the responsibility for it.
Right.
In general, because of the master's discretion over safety, when a pilot joins a ship, the pilot's working for the captain. And therefore the captain becomes responsible for those actions, which means that the captain can challenge those actions. If the captain doesn't challenge those actions and something goes wrong, the captain remains responsible. In the Panama Canal, they asked the captain to sign a waiver. He's not signing a waiver to say he's nothing to do with the safety of the ship. He is a pivotal member of the ship's crew who has responsibility for the safety of life on board the ship. When it comes to the decisions being made through the canal, then the pilots tend to, the pilotage authority takes a little bit more of the can.
So how do you keep your skills sharp, especially when dealing with so many different ship types, sizes and weather conditions?
We have a very, very intense training program, particularly in the port of Southampton. From the day you join to the day you become an unrestricted pilot is over 5.5 years long. So there's no zero to hero going on. And so your training ensures that you come out of it with all the skills necessary to pilot the size of ship that you're on. One of the things about pilotage is it tends to be a career move that you make. Very, very few people come into pilotage and go, you know what, I don't like this, I'm going to go back to sea, or I'm going to go and do something else. They stay within pilotage, and that's what makes pilotage so special, is that people will stay there for many, many years and gain vast amounts of experience, and that keeps you sharp. Obviously, we do a lot of continued professional development. We use simulators to do that. We still do courses at various colleges throughout the UK. I did a course a few years ago on climbing a pilot ladder, and I'd been a pilot for 20 years. So, you know, the updating and the CPD is there, but at the end of the day, you know, the sharpness that you keep is through practicing as a pilot. Is through, you know, conducting acts. We all conduct somewhere between 200 to 240 acts of pilotage a year. So, you know, that many acts keeps you proficient.
I tell you what, I'd love to know more about what they teach you with climbing the ladder, because I used to work in HR and health and safety, so I wonder what that looks like when they say, right, here's the ladder, climb it.
You know, climbing a pilot ladder is all about 3-point contact. Yeah, that's what we teach people. Always eyes on the prize, I always say. 3-point contact, eyes on the prize. So people climb a pilot ladder, sometimes want to look down at where they've come from or whatever. No, eyes on the prize as you climb the ladder. If you're descending down, it's different because you can't sometimes see past you. So you're relying on somebody to tell you how many steps you've got to go, etc. 3-point contact, eyes on the prize. Don't use it if it's dangerous. Slow and steady wins the day. You know, it is free climbing, so from a health and safety point of view, you know, it does throw up a lot of risk, but we deal with that risk by not trying to do it in heavy weather, by going on courses that teach us how to do it. We put the youngsters through the course very, very early. And, of course, when they come out with us as trainees, we're very, very keen on watching how they climb and don't do it so fast, or try not to take 2 steps at one time. So there's a lot of experience in piloting, and the Port of Southampton, 900 years experience or something like that between us all. A lot of that filters down, and some of it that filters down is how to get up a pilot ladder safely.
What's the most dangerous situation you've ever faced while piloting?
We've had, as a container pilot, I've had several container ships with engine problems, particularly after COVID, where the maintenance wasn't particularly done to any high level. We've had quite a few breakdowns on container ships, which have necessitated using tugs to grab hold of the ship and bring it into a safe place. Not really any major incidents beyond loss of engines, really. Some of my colleagues have had some incidents. I think one of them you wanted to discuss later on, the Hoegh Osaka, which was an incident, but that was all due to the stability of the ship. But as far as cruise ships are concerned in particular, we very, very rarely have incidents with cruise ships. If there's a problem with a cruise ship, the captains of cruise ships are very, very good at informing us. So let's say that one of the engines has got a slight problem on it and it's a bit underpowered. They'll let us know in advance. They won't let us find out the first time we try to slow the ship down, so we can put an extra tug on it, or something like that, mediate that risk and get it sorted out. Cruise ship captains are very, very good at that. They won't take a chance of hiding a defect from you.
So what's more challenging, an ultra-modern megaship or a smaller, older vessel with its own set of quirks?
You'd have to tell me what wind speed I've got for me to answer.
Okay.
These big ships they're big. They're huge. They have huge windage, and therefore, if the wind's getting up, these big ships will get blown around a lot. The smaller ships are less affected by the wind, but they're lower power. Each has its challenges. It would be unfair for me to say, no, I prefer to be on a big modern one because all of a sudden I've got 40 knots of wind and I wish I was on a little old one. So they each have their challenges, but in general, the view's better from a bigger ship as a pilot, and at the end of the day, each one, when you bring it in, is probably going to go onto a berth that's tailored to it. So the challenges are not there either. So I wouldn't like to say that one was better than the other. If you pushed me, give me a modern ship, because it's probably less likely to have any of those engine problems that we discussed.
Your dream cruise, just a click away. From luxury liners to no-fi cruises, supercruises.com makes booking simple and stress-free. Book now at supercruises.com and set sail on the trip of a lifetime. Get up to 10% off when using the code SAILAWAY10. Terms and conditions apply.
What's your favourite ship?
I was very, very lucky in my early days as a pilot. I piloted a ship called the Discovery, which used to be the Old Island Princess, which was the sister ship to the old Pacific Princess, the old Love Boat, which was my favourite ship to sail on. And so I was really, really, it was a bit surreal, actually. I'd been a pilot for about 7 or 8 years by this time, and so I'd left them about 10 years before then. And for the ship to come in and to go onto the bridge and see all the old bridge controls that I was so familiar with as navigator on that ship was a bit surreal, but I got to pilot it. So, not only was I deck officer on that ship, but I got to be pilot on there as well. So if you were to ask me what my favourite ship that I've piloted is, it would be the Discovery. I still call it the Island Princess, but that would be it. I did bring Britannia in on her on her first arrival into Southampton. I brought Britannia in, and I took her out on her inaugural cruise. I took the Anthem of the Seas out on her inaugural cruise. And a little story about that. I don't know if you remember, the Anthem of the Seas had We Will Rock You on as one of the shows on board. And the captain wanted to play We Will Rock You going down Southampton docks. And they were trying to get it piped up from below, but the guys downstairs weren't getting their act together. And there was a headphone jack up there. So I took out my phone and I called it up on the phone, and we plugged my phone into the headphone jack and we played We Will Rock You as we went down the docks at Southampton.
Brilliant.
That was a memorable inaugural cruise.
Must be a very proud moment taking a new ship out of Southampton waters?
It is. There's a lot of media attention. So you've got to get it right.
Yeah.
Not that you haven't got to get it right every time, but that's always in the back of your mind that there's a lot of cameras pointed at you. It is a proud moment. It's a proud moment for the pilot, but this is a good opportunity to say so that the pilot's part of a team in the port. And Southampton's always been a proud port when it comes to naming ships. And new ships coming and going. It's the pilot feels a bit of pride getting on a new ship, but the terminal staff, and VTS staff, a bit of pride in getting that new ship in. It'll have lots of activities going on around its inaugural visit, and it all generally runs very, very smoothly because of the huge team that we have in Southampton. We are the first and last people that the captain will see. In this hubbub of activity that's going to be going on around an inaugural visit. But there's still a whole team of people behind it. But you're right, it is a proud moment. Proud moment for everybody.
We touched on it a moment ago. The Hoegh Osaka incident in 2015 really captured public attention. Do you remember where you were when you first heard what had happened?
I was on the phone to a Princess Cruises deck cadet who was asking me some career advice. Right. Female deck cadet was asking me some careers advice about settling down and what have you. And I was talking to her and she said, "Oh, that's a bit of a mess in Southampton, isn't it?" And I was at home at the time. I said, "What's a mess in Southampton?" She said, "You haven't looked, have you?" I said, "What's going on in Southampton?" She said, "Barry, just turn on the news." So I turned on the news and there was the TV pictures of the Hoegh Osaka
on its side.
Leaning over at 41 degrees with its nose on the bramble bank.
So how did that actually happen, and what vital role did the pilot play on board?
I don't know if you remember at the time, but the media very, very quickly said that the ship was purposefully grounded onto the bramble bank because it was going to sink. Well, if you look at pictures of the ship at the time, you'll see the ship's rudder is out of the water. So there's nothing purposeful you're going to do with that ship because you've not got the control over it. If the rudder's out of the water, you can't steer it. So the ship really, really found its own way there. The reason that happened was because on a ship, it's much, much better if you have all the heavy stuff down the bottom and all the light stuff at the top. That makes the ship more stable. If you do it the other way round, that's not so great. On that ship, they did it the other way round. They had the Range Rovers up the top. They had the Renaults down the bottom. Yeah. They also had a lot of water sloshing around in their ballast tanks, which really, really doesn't help ship stability at all. It only became evident that the ship was actually unstable when she made those turns, because the forces on those turns will heel the ship over anyway. And if it's unstable, it'll heel it over till it falls over to what we call an angle of lull, which was 41 degrees on the ship. So that's how it happened. The ship flopped over, the rudder came out of the water, it rounded on itself and it grounded. Obviously, a ship at 41 degrees, even the best lashings in the world, are not going to keep your cars in one place. So all your cars started to concertina down the docks, and that just exacerbated the problem, really. Slight ingress of water as well, as it started to dip its decks below. And the result was that you had a ship that was at 41 degrees for 2 or 3 weeks, drifting around the Solent before the tugs properly got hold of it and held it in place.
Was it that whole situation initiated by the turn? It
was initiated by the turn. The forces in a turn, when you turn a ship quickly, centripetal forces push the top of the ship out. Yep. So there's an inclining force on the ship. If the ship's stable, it'll have an equal and opposite inclining force, which means that the ship will go over and it'll make the turn at a nice small angle. If the ship's unstable, it will very, very quickly lose that equal and opposite force, and therefore the ship will be able to go further and further and further. So initiating the first turn, so gentle, she was outward bound. The first turn's a lot gentler than the second turn. Initiating the first turn made it heel over quite noticeably. Initiating the second turn made it heel over so far that it went beyond the point where the very, very little positive stability that it had left was able to fight the healing force from the turn. And that's what created the problem.
So ultimately, would you say that it was probably the chief officer and the loading of the vessel that was mostly...
There's obviously been MAIB reports that have come out since then, which have identified that a lack of appreciation of the ship's stability condition on departure was the main reason why the ship ended up where it ended up. The pilot did play a pivotal role. If we go back to the original question, what role did the pilot play? obviously the pilot took the ship out, and very, very little he could do when things started to go very, very wrong. But I don't know if you're aware, but the captain fell down the bridge. The captain slid down the bridge and he damaged his chest quite badly. So when they were taking the last people off, some people were taken off by lifeboat from the stern of the ship, some were lifted off by helicopter. The captain remained until the last, but the captain couldn't put the strop on himself because he was injured. So the pilot stayed and assisted the helicopter staff with putting the strop on the captain, and they lifted the captain up first. So the last person to leave the ship was the pilot, not the captain on that particular occasion. That's because the captain was injured, so the pilot did the decent thing and helped them lift him off first.
So what's the one lesson from the Hoegh Osaka grounding that you think every maritime professional should keep in mind, no matter how experienced they are?
Complacency. It was pure complacency that they didn't check the ship's stability, because the stability on the ship had been okay for the past, however many months they'd been on board or years they'd been serving on that ship. They made the assumption that leaving the dock, stability was going to be okay. Well, bother checking it. We just put the cars in. The gauges were broken on the ballast tanks. They couldn't tell how much ballast water was in there. But that's all complacency. That's all just assuming that because the vessel's been stable for the last 10 years of its life, no matter what we did with the cars, it's going to remain stable at all time. But the stability of the ship was decreasing and decreasing and decreasing, unbeknown to them, because they didn't check it. Had they have checked the levels of the tanks, checked the weights of the cars, they would have realised that the vessel's stability was slowly decreasing. So it's complacency. It's running to and from on a car ship, doing the same thing day in, day out. I'm not recognising when critical things have changed.
It just seems incredible to me. It's such a rookie move to put all of the weight on the upper decks. Like when I was on freight ferries, it was always like the train carriages and like the tanks and heavy items that would go either into the lower hold or the main deck, and you wouldn't dream of putting them on the.
It was all about discharge ports, I think, which is why it was shuffled around like that. I think they underestimated the weights of the Range Rovers as well. Range Rovers, I think, are about 2.5 tons, 2.4 tons. I think they estimated them at 2 or even 1.9 tons. Now, with one car, that's not going to make any difference. When you've got 1,000 of them up there, it's going to make a big difference to the stability of the ship. It's all about not following up on what basic seaworthiness is, and that's making sure your ship's stable before you put to sea. Because it was stable yesterday doesn't mean it's stable today.
I wanted to ask you more about the training involved to be a pilot. So what sort of exams would you have had to have done? How do you prove that you know the Solent?
Obviously, there's your underpinning knowledge, which comes from your Master Mariner's certificate. You then join as a trainee pilot. You do 3 months as a trainee pilot and 100 acts of pilotage in those 3 months, a third of which must be at night. Once you've done that, then you'll have an assessment in and an assessment out to make sure that you can competently do the job. Once you've passed that, then you'll be put up for your exam, your first, what we call second class exam. That's a 2-hour-long verbal exam with a couple of senior pilots and the harbour master, where you're asked various questions about various manoeuvres, various ship types, tidal regimes, things like that. From then on, really, it's just a case of doing some trips on ships to learn those ships and move through the ranks right up until you get to 220 metres, when you've got another exam. You've then got your first class exam. And once you've passed your first class exam, having done lots of trips on different types of ships and tugs, you then become a first class pilot. You're still not an unrestricted pilot. You've still got 3 grades to go up, but there's no examination from that. It's all about getting experience on the ships and doing a few extra tug trips, a few extra trips on the ships that are concerned. You do continual assessment, really. Every step up has an assessment. And, as long as your assessments go well, 5 years and 8 months later, you become an unrestricted pilot.
Explain to our viewers how a massive cruise ship floats.
Ships float because there's an equal and opposite force that keeps it afloat. The force of gravity pushes down on the ship, and the force of buoyancy pushes up on a ship. Theory of flotation is that a body will displace its own mass in water. So if you take a 1 kilogram block of steel and you drop it into a glass of fresh water, it will displace 1 kilogram of water. It's as simple as that.
Yeah.
Now, when those forces are equal and opposite, that means that the ship has buoyancy. So as long as the ship hasn't sunk before it displaces its weight, it will float. So the force of buoyancy is there because the ship isn't a solid block of steel. So when you put it into water, it will displace its own weight before it sinks. That means that it is buoyant, which means that it has an upward force of buoyancy pushing on it to equal and opposite the downward force of gravity, and that means that the ship sinks.
Does it?
And that means that the ship floats.
And my last final question is, what advice would you give to someone that's thinking of potentially becoming a pilot or wants to go down that route?
So pilots are master mariners. In most ports, that's the qualification you are required to have to be a pilot. So if anybody wants to be a pilot, then the career path is obviously to go to sea as a deck cadet or go through the experienced seafarer route and attain your deck officer certification. So the first certificate is an Officer Watch Unlimited certificate, then you get a Chief Mate Unlimited certificate, then you get a Master Mariner certificate, and then most ports will then look at you with a bit of command experience to become a pilot. The whole process, it's a long process. That's what people don't realise. From becoming a deck cadet to becoming an unrestricted pilot in the port of Southampton will take you between 13 and 14 years to achieve. By the time you've done all of your certificates of competency and then gone through the pilotage training and the different classes of pilot, it's a long process. So anybody wanting to be a pilot should be ready for that long process. But becoming a deck cadet is normally the best route to take. You're sponsored to do a degree or a HNC, sponsored by a shipping company or a training company, and you'll go through a 3-year cadetship, come out with an Officer Watch Unlimited certificate, and it's onwards and upwards from there.
Best captain you've ever worked with?
Oh, my word. I have lots of friends, obviously, in P&O Princess Cruises that I was actually shipmates with. Yeah. So a lot of them, I really enjoy being with them on a ship. There's one guy, we were third officers together, Captain Paul Brown. I think Paul was on the Arvia. Paul Brown and I were third officers together on the Sea Princess in 1989. So I've known Paul now for 36 years. So Paul and I have known each other for a long, long, long time. So I think whenever I see Paul, it's a bit special because we go back a long, long way. It can get quite interesting on the AIDA ships, of course, because they have the au naturel balconies. And AIDA have decided to put those right on the side of the ship. So when you're looking at the side of the ship to berth the ship, sometimes you don't have the choice other than to look across the natural balcony.
Thank God it's not on the forecastle.
Well, it's on the forecastle. You have to look at it for 3 hours. At least you only have to look at it for half an hour while the ship's berthing.
Early morning arrival or late night departure?
Early morning arrival.
Do you get breakfast?
Yes.
Have you ever fallen in?
No.
Controlled seas or controlled chaos?
Controlled seas.
Megaship or classic liner?
Classic liner.
Tugs or thrusters?
On a cruise ship, thrusters.
What's harder, high winds or strong currents?
Higher winds, because currents tend to be consistent. Higher winds are a bit gusty, so the forces go up and down a little bit unpredictably.
Would you rather pilot in thick fog or a sudden squall?
Thick fog. Again, consistency. Sudden squalls come up very, very quickly. Sometimes difficult to control.
If you weren't a pilot, what would you be doing today?
Do you know what? I've always been at sea. As I said at the start of the interview, I went to sea at 16. My dad was a chartered surveyor, which I always used to find interesting. But if somebody were to say to me, what would you have preferred to do? You know, the last 40 years at sea or a charter surveyor? It would be the last 40 years at sea.
Barry, thanks so much for coming.
Thank you so
My
much.
pleasure, guys.
Thank
Great
you.
to talk to you.
The Sail Away Uncensored Cruise Podcast.